Overcrowding and poor conditions. One of the most pressing issues inside São Luís Female Prison is extreme overcrowding. The facility was originally designed to hold a limited number of inmates, but today, it houses far more than its intended capacity. Cells built to accommodate a handful of prisoners are now packed with dozens of women, forcing them to share limited space, sleeping on makeshift beds, hammocks, or even the cold, hard floor. In some cases, prisoners take turns sleeping because there simply isn't enough room for everyone to lie down at the same time. Overcrowding leads to severe consequences beyond just discomfort. With so many inmates crammed into small spaces, the spread of disease is rampant. Skin infections, respiratory illnesses, and waterborne diseases thrive in these conditions due to poor sanitation and limited access to clean water. Inmates often have no choice but to share a single toilet with dozens of others, and plumbing issues frequently result in raw sewage backing up into cells. The smell of human waste lingers in the air, creating an unbearable living environment. Additionally, the prison lacks proper ventilation, turning cells into suffocating heat traps, especially during Brazil's scorching summers. Without proper airflow or cooling systems, prisoners are left to endure unbearable temperatures that can lead to dehydration, heat stroke, and other serious health complications. Food shortages are another direct consequence of overcrowding. The prison's food supply is stretched thin, and what little food is provided is often of poor quality. Meals typically consist of watered-down rice, beans, and stale bread, with little to no nutritional value. Malnutrition is common, weakening inmates' immune systems and leaving them vulnerable to illness. Those who cannot afford to buy extra food from the prison commissary must survive on these inadequate meals, further exacerbating health problems. The lack of space and resources also creates an environment of heightened tension and aggression. When hundreds of women are forced to live in such close quarters, conflicts inevitably arise. Fights break out over basic necessities like food, water, or even a place to sleep. Inmates who are perceived as weak or without connections often suffer the most, becoming targets of violence and intimidation. The overcrowding problem in São Luís Female Prison is not an isolated issue, but rather a symptom of Brazil's larger prison crisis. The country's judicial system is known for its high incarceration rates, particularly for non-violent drug offenses. Many of the women imprisoned in São Luís are serving long sentences for minor crimes, contributing to the ever-growing prison population. With few alternatives to incarceration and slow judicial processes, the number of inmates continues to rise, further straining the already overwhelmed facility. Despite the dire conditions, little is done to address the issue. Government funding for prison infrastructure is insufficient, and attempts to reduce the prison population through policy reforms are slow-moving. In the meantime, thousands of women remain trapped in a system that offers little hope for rehabilitation or a chance at a better future. Lack of basic necessities. One of the most dehumanizing aspects of life inside São Luís Female Prison is the severe lack of basic necessities. For many inmates, even the most fundamental human needs, clean water, food, hygiene, and medical care, are difficult to access. The prison system, already overburdened by overcrowding, fails to provide these essentials in adequate supply, leaving thousands of women to suffer in unsanitary and dangerous conditions. Water and sanitation. Access to clean water is one of the biggest challenges inmates face. The prison's water supply is unreliable, often shutting off for hours or even days at a time. When this happens, prisoners are forced to ration whatever water they have left, sometimes going without drinking water for extended periods. Inmates frequently resort to drinking from contaminated sources, leading to gastrointestinal illnesses, dehydration, and kidney problems. The prison's plumbing system is also in disrepair, causing frequent sewage backups that flood the cells and communal areas with human waste. Toilets often do not function properly, and with so many women sharing limited facilities, they quickly become filthy and unhygienic. Many prisoners are forced to relieve themselves in buckets, which only adds to the overwhelming stench that fills the prison corridors. Without proper sanitation, infections spread rapidly, and conditions like urinary tract infections, skin diseases, and parasitic infestations are common. Food shortages and malnutrition. The food situation in São Luís Female Prison is equally dire. Meals provided by the prison are meager, lacking in both quantity and nutritional value. A typical meal consists of a small portion of rice and beans, sometimes accompanied by a piece of bread or a watery soup. Protein is scarce, and fresh fruits and vegetables are almost non-existent. Many inmates suffer from malnutrition, their bodies growing weaker over time due to a lack of essential nutrients. Hunger is a constant struggle, and those without family support are hit the hardest. Some prisoners rely on money sent by relatives to buy extra food from the prison commissary, but prices are often inflated, making even the most basic items unaffordable for many. Those who cannot afford extra food must simply endure hunger, growing weaker and more vulnerable to illness. Lack of hygiene products. Basic hygiene is another critical issue. Women in São Luís Female Prison are not provided with enough soap, shampoo, toothpaste, or menstrual products. Many are forced to reuse old rags as makeshift sanitary pads, putting them at risk of infections. Others go, without any menstrual products at all, forced to sit on the bare, dirty floors during their periods. Showers are limited, and with so many women sharing too few facilities, access to bathing is inconsistent. Some inmates go days without being able to wash themselves, leading to body odor, skin conditions, and a general sense of uncleanliness that only adds to their suffering. The lack of hygiene supplies also means that lice and other parasites spread easily, further worsening the already unsanitary conditions. Medical neglect. Perhaps the most alarming consequence of the lack of basic necessities is the state of medical care. Healthcare in São Luís Female Prison is almost non-existent, and inmates suffering from serious illnesses often go untreated. There is a severe shortage of doctors and nurses, and medical attention is only given in extreme cases. Even then, prisoners must often wait weeks or months to see a doctor, by which time their conditions may have worsened beyond treatment. Pregnant inmates face even greater challenges. Many receive little to no prenatal care, putting both their health and the health of their babies at risk. When it comes time to give birth, some women are shackled during labor, a practice that has been widely condemned as inhumane. After childbirth, newborns are often separated from their mothers within months, adding to the emotional trauma these women endure. Many prisoners also suffer from chronic illnesses such as diabetes, hypertension, and respiratory diseases, but without regular medication or proper care, their conditions deteriorate rapidly. Those with mental health disorders receive no psychiatric treatment, leading to high rates of depression, anxiety, and even suicide attempts. A daily struggle for survival. With the prison failing to provide even the most basic necessities, many inmates must rely on each other to survive. Women share what little they have, trading items like soap or extra food to make it through another day. Others form small support networks, looking after one another in an environment where kindness is rare. However, these efforts can only do so much in a system that is fundamentally broken. Women struggles, the stories behind bars. The women incarcerated in São Luís Female Prison are not just criminals. They are individuals with stories of hardship, loss, and survival. Many of them come from backgrounds of poverty, domestic abuse, and limited education, factors that have played a significant role in leading them to prison. Their crimes often reflect their struggles, with a majority of women convicted for non-violent offenses such as drug trafficking, theft, or fraud, crimes committed not out of malice but out of desperation. The path to incarceration. For many women, their journey to São Luís begins long before they step inside the prison walls. Brazil's justice system disproportionately punishes the poor, and women from low-income backgrounds are particularly vulnerable. A large percentage of female prisoners were arrested for drug-related offenses, but unlike major drug traffickers, they were not high-ranking criminals. Many of them were caught as drug mules, carrying small amounts of drugs across cities or even borders in exchange for money to feed their families. Some of these women were coerced into crime by abusive partners or family members. In many cases, they were victims long before they became offenders. Trapped in cycles of domestic violence, some women turned to theft or drug dealing as a means of survival. Others were forced into crime by gangs that operate both inside and outside of the prison system. Single mothers behind bars. A significant number of inmates in São Luís are mothers, many of them single mothers who were the sole providers for their children before their arrest. When a woman is imprisoned, her children often suffer the most. In Brazil, there are few social programs to support the children of incarcerated women, leaving many to be placed in the care of distant relatives, orphanages, or, in the worst cases, the streets. Some women give birth while in prison, raising their infants in an environment that is far from safe for a child. Due to Brazilian law, children born in prison can only stay with their mothers until they are around 6 months to a year old, after which they are taken away. For many incarcerated mothers, this separation is one of the most painful experiences of their lives. The psychological toll of incarceration. The emotional and psychological impact of imprisonment on women in São Luís is immense. Many arrive at the prison already carrying the trauma of past abuse, addiction, or loss, only to find themselves in an even more dehumanizing environment. Depression, anxiety, and PTSD are widespread among the inmates, but mental health care is almost non-existent. Loneliness is another significant struggle. Unlike male prisoners, who often receive more frequent visits from family members, female inmates are often abandoned by their loved ones. Husbands or partners frequently leave them. Family members distance themselves, and society views them as irredeemable. The lack of emotional support deepens their suffering, making it even harder to find hope within the prison walls. Discrimination and violence. Women in São Luís do not only suffer from neglect, they also face discrimination and violence. Female inmates often experience different forms of mistreatment than their male counterparts. Sexual abuse by prison guards and other inmates is a well-known but rarely addressed problem. Many women are too afraid to report these incidents, knowing that speaking out could lead to retaliation or further punishment. In addition to physical abuse, verbal and emotional abuse is common. The prison staff, overwhelmed and undertrained, often treat inmates with cruelty rather than dignity. Women are called names, humiliated, and treated as less than human, reinforcing a sense of hopelessness and worthlessness. A fight for redemption. Despite the unbearable struggles they face, many women in São Luís still fight for a second chance. Some find solace in religious groups, education programs, or small jobs within the prison. They try to better themselves, hoping that one day they can rebuild their lives outside the prison walls. But with the lack of proper rehabilitation programs and support systems, many fear that even if they are released, they will have nowhere to go and no way to escape the cycle of crime and poverty that led them to prison in the first place. Mothers behind bars, raising children in São Luís Female Prison. One of the most heartbreaking realities of São Luís Female Prison is the number of incarcerated mothers who are forced to raise their children behind bars or endure painful separations. Many of these women were the primary or sole caregivers for their children before their arrest, and their imprisonment not only affects their own lives, but also has devastating consequences for their families. The fate of these mothers and their children is shaped by a prison system that lacks compassion, proper resources, and sufficient support for women with young dependents. Pregnancy in prison. For pregnant women in São Luís Female Prison, conditions are incredibly harsh. The prison lacks adequate prenatal care, meaning many expectant mothers go through pregnancy without regular medical checkups, proper nutrition, or necessary supplements. Given the poor quality of food in the prison, many pregnant inmates suffer from malnutrition, which can lead to complications during childbirth and developmental issues for their unborn children. Labor and childbirth within the prison system are particularly inhumane. Many women are taken to outside hospitals only at the last minute, and some have reported being shackled during labor, a practice condemned by human rights organizations worldwide. Others give birth in unsanitary prison conditions without professional medical assistance. After childbirth, these women are often sent back to their overcrowded, dirty cells almost immediately, with little time to recover physically or emotionally. Raising children in prison. Brazilian law allows children born in prison to stay with their mothers for only a limited period, usually 6 months to a year. However, during this time, both mother and child live in conditions far from suitable for raising an infant. The overcrowding, lack of hygiene, and constant exposure to disease make it extremely difficult for mothers to care for their babies properly. There are no proper nurseries or child-friendly facilities in São Luís Female Prison. Instead, babies sleep alongside their mothers in cramped cells, exposed to the same dangers as the inmates. Basic supplies like diapers, formula, and baby clothes are scarce, and unless a mother has family members who can bring these necessities from outside, she may struggle to provide even the most basic care for a child. The psychological toll on these women is immense. Many of them already carry deep emotional scars from difficult pasts, and raising a child in such an environment only adds to their stress and anxiety. They are painfully aware that their children are growing up in a place filled with violence, deprivation, and suffering. The forced separation. Once a child reaches the maximum age allowed to stay in prison, they're taken away from their mother, often permanently. For most of these women, this is the most devastating moment of their sentence. Their children are either placed in the care of relatives, taken into the foster care system, or, in some cases, abandoned entirely if no one is available to take them in. Many mothers have little to no contact with their children after they leave the prison. Visitation rights are difficult to arrange, and because São Luís Female Prison is overcrowded and poorly managed, the process of applying for visits is slow and bureaucratic. Some women never see their children again after they are taken away, leaving them to suffer in silence, burdened by the pain of separation. For children, being taken from their mother at such a young age can cause deep emotional trauma. Many grow up feeling abandoned, and those placed in orphanages or the foster care system often struggle with instability and neglect. The cycle of suffering continues, as children of incarcerated mothers are statistically more likely to end up in the criminal justice system themselves. Lack of support from mothers post-prison. When these women eventually complete their sentences and are released, they often find that reintegrating into society is nearly impossible. Many struggle to reconnect with their children, especially if they have been placed in foster care or adopted. Finding work and housing is a major challenge, as society stigmatizes formerly incarcerated women, particularly those who are mothers. Without proper rehabilitation programs or social support, many of these women find themselves trapped in the same cycle of poverty and desperation that led to their imprisonment in the first place. Some end up reoffending simply because they have no other way to survive. The system fails them at every stage, before prison, during their sentence, and after their release. Mothers behind bars, raising children in São Luís Female Prison. One of the most tragic aspects of São Luís Female Prison is the number of incarcerated mothers who are forced to either raise their children behind bars or endure the heartbreak of separation. For many of these women, prison is not just a punishment for their crimes. It is a sentence that extends to their families, particularly their young children. The Brazilian prison system is ill-equipped to handle the unique needs of mothers and their children, resulting in emotional distress, broken families, and long-term psychological scars. The struggles of pregnant women in prison. Pregnancy in São Luís Female Prison is particularly dangerous due to the lack of proper medical care, nutrition, and support. Many women enter the prison already malnourished and struggling with health issues, and the poor quality prison food provides little nourishment for them or their growing babies. The limited supply of vitamins and prenatal care means that many pregnant inmates suffer from anemia, dehydration, and other pregnancy-related complications that go untreated. Access to medical checkups is inconsistent, and prenatal care is virtually non-existent unless a woman experiences a severe health crisis. When they do receive medical attention, it is often delayed and inadequate, leading to higher risks of complications during childbirth. In some cases, pregnant women are not taken to hospitals in time and are forced to give birth inside the prison under unsanitary and dangerous conditions, with little to no medical assistance. Those who are taken to outside hospitals to give birth often experience degrading treatment. Some are shackled to hospital beds during labor, a practice that has been widely condemned as a human rights violation. Others are treated with indifference or outright hostility by medical staff who see them only as criminals, rather than as vulnerable women in need of care. After childbirth, these women receive little to no postpartum medical attention, even if they have undergone traumatic or complicated deliveries. Many are forced to return to their overcrowded, unhygienic cells within days, with no time to recover physically or emotionally. Raising children in prison. Brazilian law permits children born in prison to stay with their mothers for a limited period, usually until they are between 6 months to 1 year old. While this policy is meant to promote bonding between mother and child, the reality is that prison is no place for a baby. The overcrowded and unsanitary conditions in São Luís mean that newborns are exposed to disease, malnutrition, and emotional distress from the moment they enter the world. There are no proper nurseries or childcare facilities in the prison. Babies sleep in the same cramped, dirty cells as their mothers, often on thin mattresses or even the floor. The prison does not provide adequate baby supplies such as diapers, formula, or clothing, forcing mothers to rely on donations from family members or charities, if they are fortunate enough to receive them. Many mothers go without essential items, doing their best to care for their infants with whatever little resources they have. The lack of medical care extends to the babies as well. Routine checkups, vaccinations, and pediatric care are limited, putting infants at risk of infections and developmental issues. Given the harsh conditions, many newborns suffer from low birth weights, respiratory illnesses, and digestive problems due to the poor quality of food and water in the prison. For the mothers, raising a child in prison is an overwhelming emotional challenge. Many experience severe postpartum depression but receive no psychological support. They must navigate the daily struggles of prison life, violence, hunger, and despair, while trying to provide comfort and care for their infants. The knowledge that their child will soon be taken away from them only adds to their suffering. The pain of separation. Perhaps the most devastating moment for incarcerated mothers in São Luís is when their children reach the maximum age allowed to stay in prison and are taken away from them. For many, this marks the beginning of an indefinite separation. Some children are placed in the care of relatives, but in cases where family support is unavailable, they are sent to foster care or orphanages, where they may never see their mothers again. The psychological toll of this forced separation is immense. Mothers are left in deep emotional distress, knowing that their children are growing up without them. Many fear that their children will suffer neglect or abuse in foster care, while others worry that their sons and daughters will never understand why they were taken away. The guilt and helplessness that these women experience can lead to severe depression, self-harm, and in some cases, suicide attempts. For the children, being taken from their mothers at such a young age can have lasting emotional consequences. Studies have shown that children of incarcerated parents are more likely to experience anxiety, depression, and attachment disorders. Many struggle with feelings of abandonment and confusion, particularly if they do not understand why their mother was taken from them. Without stable family support, some of these children end up on the streets, vulnerable to exploitation and crime, a cycle that continues across generations. Barriers to reuniting with children after release. Even after serving their sentences, many incarcerated mothers in São Luís face significant challenges in reuniting with their children. For those whose children were placed in foster care, regaining custody is a long and difficult legal process, often requiring financial stability and proof of rehabilitation, something that is nearly impossible for many formerly incarcerated women. Society's stigma against female prisoners further complicates the issue. Many women struggle to find jobs or housing after their release, making it difficult to provide for their children. Employers are reluctant to hire former inmates, and without financial independence, some women fall back into cycles of crime simply to survive. Additionally, many children grow up feeling disconnected from their mothers, especially if they were raised by other relatives or in institutions. The emotional distance created by years of separation makes it difficult to rebuild relationships, leaving many former prisoners feeling like strangers to their own children. The lack of support for incarcerated mothers. Despite the overwhelming challenges that incarcerated mothers face, Brazil's prison system provides little to no support for them. There are few rehabilitation programs designed specifically for women, and the unique needs of mothers, such as parenting classes, mental health support, and reintegration programs, are largely ignored. In other countries, alternative sentencing programs have been introduced to allow non-violent offenders who are mothers to serve their sentences under house arrest or in community-based programs instead of prison. Such initiatives recognize the importance of keeping families together and preventing the long-term damage caused by separating mothers from their children. However, in Brazil, the judicial system remains focused on punitive measures rather than rehabilitation, overcrowding, and inhumane living conditions. One of the most severe problems inside São Luís Female Prison is the extreme overcrowding and the inhumane living conditions that inmates endure daily. The facility, originally designed to house far fewer prisoners, now holds well beyond its intended capacity, creating an environment that is both physically and mentally unbearable. Cells meant to accommodate a handful of women are crammed with 2 or 3 times as many inmates, forcing prisoners to sleep on the floor, share limited resources, and survive in an atmosphere of constant stress, tension, and violence. Overcrowding, a system at its breaking point. Brazil's prison system is notorious for its overcrowding crisis, and São Luís Female Prison is no exception. With an increasing number of women being incarcerated, many for non-violent crimes such as drug possession or theft, the prison population has skyrocketed in recent years. The legal system frequently imposes harsh sentences on women from disadvantaged backgrounds, leading to an influx of inmates that the facility simply cannot accommodate. Inside the prison, cells that were originally designed for 5 or 6 inmates now hold 15 or more. The lack of space means that many women are forced to sleep on the hard, filthy floor, using makeshift bedding such as torn sheets or cardboard. Others share small, rusted bunk beds, with some taking turns sleeping in shifts due to the lack of room. Privacy is non-existent, and inmates live in unbearably close quarters, with little room to move or even sit comfortably. The overcrowding extends beyond the cells. Communal areas such as the dining hall, showers, and exercise spaces are also overwhelmed, making even basic activities like eating, bathing, or stretching incredibly difficult. The strain on resources means that inmates must rush through meals, wait for hours to use a bathroom, and struggle to find a place to sit in common areas. Hygiene and sanitation, a breeding ground for disease. With so many women packed into such a small space, sanitation quickly becomes a major issue. São Luís Female Prison lacks sufficient bathrooms and showers, meaning that inmates often go days without being able to wash themselves properly. The prison's water supply is unreliable, and when there is no running water, women are forced to ration whatever small amounts they have saved, using dirty water to wash, cook, and even drink. The plumbing system is in a constant state of disrepair, with broken pipes and overflowing sewage creating a stench that lingers throughout the facility. Toilets frequently clog, and with not enough of them to accommodate the number of prisoners, many women are forced to relieve themselves in plastic bags or buckets, which are then discarded in already filthy hallways. The lack of soap, menstrual hygiene products, and cleaning supplies further worsens the situation, leading to widespread infections, lice infestations, and chronic illnesses among the inmates. Many women suffer from skin diseases, respiratory infections, and stomach illnesses caused by the poor hygiene conditions. Without access to proper medical care, even minor health issues can quickly become serious, with inmates left to suffer in pain for weeks or months before receiving any treatment. food shortages, and malnutrition. The overcrowding crisis has also led to severe food shortages, with the prisons struggling to provide adequate meals for the growing population. The food that is served is barely enough to sustain the inmates, often consisting of small portions of rice, beans, and a thin soup with little nutritional value. Protein is a luxury, and fresh vegetables or fruit are almost never included in meals. Due to the overwhelming number of prisoners, food is rationed, and fights often break out over portions. Those who do not receive financial support from their families are at a particular disadvantage, as they cannot afford to buy extra food from the prison commissary. Many inmates go to bed hungry, their bodies growing weaker over time due to malnutrition. The poor quality of food also leads to frequent cases of food poisoning, with inmates suffering from severe stomach cramps, vomiting, and diarrhea. With no access to proper health care, these conditions can become life-threatening, especially for those already suffering from weakened immune systems due to the prison's unhygienic environment, violence, and tension in overcrowded spaces. With so many women crammed into an overcrowded and under-resourced environment, tensions run high. Inmates are constantly under stress, struggling to navigate daily life in a space that offers no relief from the chaos. Fights break out frequently, often over small disputes regarding food, sleeping space, or access to basic resources. The lack of proper supervision only makes the problem worse. São Luís Female Prison is severely understaffed, with guards overwhelmed by the sheer number of inmates they are responsible for managing. This creates a dangerous power vacuum where gangs and dominant prisoners impose their own rules through violence and intimidation. New inmates, especially those who are weak, elderly, or without gang affiliations, are often targeted for bullying, extortion, and abuse. The constant threat of violence forces many women to align themselves with prison gangs for protection, even if it means becoming involved in further criminal activities. The psychological toll of overcrowding. Beyond the physical hardships, the psychological impact of overcrowding in São Luís Female Prison is devastating. Inmates suffer from extreme stress, anxiety, and depression due to the lack of space, privacy, and basic human dignity. The noise, the constant smell of filth, and the overwhelming sense of despair make it nearly impossible for prisoners to find any peace. Many inmates experience severe mental health breakdowns, but the prison offers no psychological support. There are no therapists or counselors available to help women cope with the emotional trauma of imprisonment. Suicidal thoughts and self-harm are common, as inmates see no hope for a future beyond the suffocating walls of São Luís. The overcrowding also means that rehabilitation efforts are nearly non-existent. With so many prisoners to manage, the system focuses only on containment rather than education, skill development, or reintegration programs. For many women, their time in São Luís does nothing to prepare them for a life outside prison. It only deepens their sense of hopelessness and isolation, lack of health care, and medical neglect. The healthcare crisis inside São Luís Female Prison is one of the most devastating aspects of incarceration for the women who live there. With an overcrowded facility, a shortage of medical personnel, and virtually no access to proper treatment, inmates suffer from a range of untreated illnesses, injuries, and chronic conditions. The prison system fails to recognize healthcare as a basic human right, leaving women to endure extreme physical and mental suffering with little to no intervention. Limited access to medical care. São Luís Female Prison lacks a fully functioning healthcare facility, forcing inmates to rely on an understaffed and poorly equipped infirmary. There are rarely enough doctors, nurses, or even basic medical supplies to treat the overwhelming number of health issues that arise in the prison. Many women enter the facility with pre-existing conditions such as diabetes, high blood pressure, or infections, but once inside, they receive little to no medical attention. Inmates who fall seriously ill often have to wait weeks or even months before seeing a doctor. The prison's healthcare system operates on a triage basis, meaning that only those with life-threatening conditions receive immediate attention. However, Because many illnesses go untreated for long periods, minor health issues can quickly escalate into serious medical emergencies. When prisoners do receive medical care, it is often inadequate. Doctors visit infrequently, and when they do, they spend only a few minutes examining each patient, often prescribing painkillers or antibiotics without fully diagnosing the underlying problem. Many inmates report that their symptoms are ignored or dismissed by medical staff, who assume they're exaggerating their pain in an attempt to gain special treatment. Hygiene-related illnesses and infections. The lack of proper sanitation in São Luís Female Prison creates a breeding ground for disease. Inmates suffer from a range of hygiene-related illnesses, including skin infections, respiratory conditions, and gastrointestinal diseases caused by contaminated food and water. Fungal infections, lice infestations, and scabies are rampant due to overcrowding and the lack of access to clean water. Many women are forced to share unwashed bedding and clothing, making it nearly impossible to prevent the spread of these conditions. Basic hygiene products, such as soap, toothpaste, and sanitary pads, are in short supply, leaving women vulnerable to urinary tract infections, bacterial infections, and other preventable illnesses. With no reliable access to medical treatment, many women are left to suffer for weeks or months without relief. Some attempt to treat their own conditions using makeshift remedies, but without proper medication, their illnesses often worsen. Chronic illnesses and lack of treatment. Women with chronic illnesses face particularly dire conditions in São Luís Female Prison. Conditions such as diabetes, hypertension, asthma, and epilepsy require ongoing medical care, but in prison, medications are often unavailable or irregularly distributed. Diabetic inmates, for example, struggle to maintain their health due to the poor quality prison diet, which consists mostly of carbohydrates and lacks the necessary nutrients to stabilize their blood sugar levels. Insulin, when available, is often administered inconsistently, putting diabetic prisoners at risk of serious complications such as infections, kidney failure, and even death. Similarly, inmates with high blood pressure or heart conditions often go months without proper medication, leading to an increased risk of strokes or heart attacks. Women with asthma or other respiratory illnesses struggle to breathe in the prison's polluted, overcrowded environment, yet inhalers and other necessary treatments are rarely provided. For those suffering from chronic pain, the situation is even worse. With little access to pain relief medication, many inmates are left to endure their suffering in silence. Some resort to self-medicating with whatever substances they can find, including smuggled drugs, further worsening their health. Pregnancy and maternal health risks. Pregnant women face some of the worst conditions when it comes to health care in São Luís Female Prison. The lack of prenatal care means that expectant mothers receive little medical attention during their pregnancies, increasing the risk of complications such as premature birth, low birth weight, and maternal mortality. Many pregnant inmates suffer from malnutrition due to the poor quality prison diet, which lacks the essential vitamins and minerals needed for a healthy pregnancy. Some women develop anemia or high blood pressure, conditions that can be dangerous if left untreated. Yet, despite these risks, there is no guarantee that a pregnant inmate will receive medical checkups, ultrasounds, or even basic prenatal vitamins. When it comes time to give birth, the situation is equally dire. Many women are taken to hospitals only at the last minute, and some have reported being shackled during labor, an inhumane practice that has been condemned by human rights organizations worldwide. Others are forced to give birth inside the prison itself, often in unsanitary conditions, with little or no medical assistance. The postpartum period is no better. Women who have just given birth receive no special treatment or medical care, often being sent back to their overcrowded cells within days. Without access to proper postpartum care, many suffer from infections, complications, or severe postpartum depression, mental health neglect, and psychological trauma. The mental health crisis in São Luís Female Prison is just as severe as the physical health crisis, yet it is almost entirely ignored by the prison system. Many women enter the facility already struggling with mental health disorders such as depression, anxiety, and PTSD, often due to histories of domestic violence, drug addiction, or sexual abuse. However, once inside, they receive no psychological support or counseling. The prison environment itself exacerbates these conditions. The constant stress of overcrowding, violence, and poor living conditions takes a serious toll on inmates' mental well-being. Many women suffer from severe depression and anxiety, made worse by the lack of contact with their families and children. The feelings of isolation and hopelessness are overwhelming, yet there are no therapists or mental health professionals available to help them cope. Self-harm and suicide attempts are common among inmates. But instead of receiving support, women who show signs of severe distress are often punished or placed in solitary confinement. This only deepens their suffering, reinforcing the cycle of neglect and psychological deterioration. Substance abuse is also a significant issue among incarcerated women, many of whom turn to drugs as a way to cope with past trauma. However, there are no rehabilitation programs inside the prison, leaving women trapped in addiction with no access to treatment. Some inmates attempt to smuggle in drugs as a way to escape their reality, but those caught are severely punished, often receiving extended sentences that keep them trapped in the cycle of incarceration. The deadly consequences of medical neglect. The lack of health care in São Luís Female Prison has deadly consequences. Inmates suffering from treatable illnesses often die simply because they are denied medical attention. There have been cases of women dying from infections that could have been treated with basic antibiotics, as well as cases of prisoners suffering fatal complications from untreated chronic diseases. Those who do manage to receive medical treatment are often too far gone by the time they see a doctor. Many women are only taken to hospitals when their conditions reach a critical stage, by which time it is often too late to save them. The system fails these women at every level, treating them as disposable rather than as human beings deserving of care. Violence and abuse inside the prison. São Luís Female Prison is not just a place of confinement. It is a battleground where violence, abuse, and exploitation are a daily reality. Inmates are subjected to a brutal environment where physical, sexual, and psychological abuse are rampant, often with little to no intervention from authorities. The combination of overcrowding, gang control, corrupt prison staff, and the absence of legal protection creates a system where the weak suffer at the hands of the strong, and where justice is rarely served. Physical violence among inmates. The overcrowded and chaotic nature of São Luís Female Prison leads to frequent violent clashes between inmates. Many of these women come from backgrounds of hardship, crime, and abuse, and once inside, they are forced to fight for survival. Disputes over food, sleeping space, and personal belongings can quickly escalate into full-blown fights, with inmates attacking one another using makeshift weapons like sharpened toothbrushes, metal scraps, or even boiling water. Gangs play a major role in fueling violence inside the prison. Many of the women in São Luís have ties to organized crime outside, and those who do not are often forced to either align with a gang or risk becoming a target. New inmates, particularly those without connections or financial resources, are the most vulnerable. They are often bullied, beaten, or forced into servitude by more dominant prisoners. Revenge attacks are also common. In an environment where there is little legal recourse for grievances, inmates take justice into their own hands. If a woman is suspected of betraying a gang or informing on another prisoner, she is likely to be attacked, sometimes in a brutal and public fashion. In some cases, women have been found severely beaten, with broken bones or deep stab wounds, and yet medical attention remains scarce. Sexual abuse, and exploitation. One of the darkest realities of São Luís Female Prison is the widespread sexual abuse that occurs within its walls. Women, many of whom have already suffered sexual violence in their past, are subjected to further exploitation in the hands of both fellow inmates and corrupt prison staff. Some women are forced into relationships with stronger, more dominant inmates as a means of protection. These relationships are not always consensual, with weaker prisoners having little choice but to comply to avoid physical harm or worse. Gang leaders sometimes use their power to coerce new inmates into sexual servitude, offering food, water, or safety in exchange for submission. The role of prison guards in the abuse is even more alarming. Corrupt officers take advantage of the power imbalance, preying on vulnerable inmates who have no means of defending themselves. In exchange for sexual favors, guards may offer better living conditions, extra food, or protection from violent inmates. Those who refuse often face harsh retaliation, including beatings, solitary confinement, or fabricated disciplinary charges that can extend their sentences. Despite the severity of these crimes, justice is rarely served. Women who report sexual abuse are often ignored or punished for speaking out. Fear of retaliation prevents many from coming forward, leaving perpetrators free to continue their abuse without consequence. The absence of oversight and accountability means that sexual violence remains an unspoken but well-known reality inside São Luís. Psychological and emotional abuse. Beyond physical and sexual violence, inmates at São Luís suffer from relentless psychological and emotional abuse. Guards frequently degrade and humiliate prisoners, treating them as less than human. Insults, threats, and verbal harassment are part of daily life, with officers reminding inmates that they have no rights and no worth. Isolation is another form of psychological torture used within the prison. Women who disobey guards or get into fights are often placed in solitary confinement, where they are left alone in dark, cramped cells for days or even weeks at a time. The extreme isolation takes a devastating toll on mental health, leading many inmates to suffer from severe depression, anxiety, and even hallucinations. Inmates also experience psychological abuse from fellow prisoners. Many women who enter São Luís already suffer from trauma, whether from abusive relationships, drug addiction, or childhood neglect. Instead of finding a path to rehabilitation, they're often broken down further by the cruelty of the prison environment. Those who show signs of weakness are taunted, manipulated, and exploited by others who see them as easy targets. The role of corruption in perpetuating violence. Corruption is deeply embedded in the fabric of São Luís Female Prison, making it nearly impossible to put an end to the violence and abuse. Many prison guards are complicit in criminal activities, working alongside inmates to smuggle in drugs, weapons, and contraband in exchange for bribes. Guards turn a blind eye to violent altercations, allowing gang leaders to run the prison with near total control. In some cases, prison staff even orchestrate fights between inmates, using violence as a way to maintain their own power and dominance. Women who refuse to comply with corrupt officers may find themselves placed in the most dangerous areas of the prison, intentionally exposed to violent gangs as a form of punishment. Money plays a significant role in determining who is protected and who is left vulnerable. Inmates with financial resources can bribe guards for privileges such as better sleeping arrangements, access to food, or even early release. Those without money are left to fend for themselves, often forced into dangerous and degrading situations just to survive. The fear that never ends. For the women inside São Luís Female Prison, the fear of violence is constant. Every day is a battle to stay alive, to avoid becoming the next victim of a brutal beating, an act of sexual violence, or a corrupt scheme. The prison provides no sense of security, only a never-ending struggle for survival. The long-term effects of living under such conditions are devastating. Many women who leave São Luís do so with deep psychological scars, unable to reintegrate into society due to the trauma they have endured. Some develop severe PTSD, experiencing nightmares, paranoia, and extreme distrust of others. Others fall back into cycles of crime and addiction, having learned that violence and exploitation are the only ways to navigate the world. Would you like me to expand on another key point? You said, expand the 8 key, make it lengthy, don't add ending. ChatGPT said, 8. Corruption and the power of criminal organizations. Corruption is deeply entrenched in São Luís Female Prison, creating an environment where crime thrives within the very institution meant to rehabilitate and punish offenders. Instead of enforcing law and order, many prison officials actively contribute to the chaos by accepting bribes, facilitating smuggling operations, and turning a blind eye to violence. This corruption enables powerful criminal organizations to control large portions of the prison, forcing weaker inmates into submission and perpetuating a cycle of crime that extends far beyond the prison walls. The role of corrupt guards in maintaining criminal power. At São Luís, many prison guards are not simply enforcers of rules, but active participants in the criminal underworld. With low salaries and poor working conditions, some officers see corruption as an opportunity to make extra money. Instead of preventing crime, they profit from it, working alongside powerful inmates to smuggle in drugs, weapons, and other contraband. Guards accept bribes in exchange for special privileges, allowing certain inmates to enjoy luxuries that others can only dream of. Those with money or gang affiliations can pay for access to better food, private sleeping quarters, and even cell phones, which they use to continue operating criminal enterprises from behind bars. In some cases, corrupt officers even help arrange escapes, allowing dangerous criminals to walk free while weaker inmates remain trapped in the system. The power imbalance created by this corruption means that justice is rarely served inside São Luís. If a prisoner has a complaint, whether about violence, abuse, or medical neglect, there is little they can do. Reporting an incident often results in retaliation, either from the guards themselves or for the criminal organizations that run the prison. As a result, most inmates choose to stay silent, enduring their suffering rather than risking further harm. Gang control, a prison within a prison. São Luís Female Prison is not just controlled by the official authorities. It is also ruled by powerful gangs that operate both inside and outside its walls. These criminal organizations dictate much of what happens within the prison, from who gets access to food and water to who lives and who dies. New inmates are often forced to pledge allegiance to a gang for protection. Those who refuse are vulnerable to attack, extortion, or even sexual slavery. The gangs control everything, from the distribution of smuggled goods to the enforcement of their own brutal justice system. If an inmate crosses a gang member, the punishment can be swift and severe, often involving violent beatings, stabbings, or worse. Gang leaders have more power than the prison guards in many cases. They impose their own rules, demand loyalty, and dictate how conflicts are resolved. This underground power structure means that true rehabilitation is nearly impossible. Women who enter São Luís hoping to serve their time and move on with their lives often find themselves deeper in crime by the time they leave, caught in a system that forces them to choose between submission or survival. Drug trade and smuggling operations. Drugs flow freely inside São Luís, despite strict laws prohibiting them. The smuggling network, run by both inmates and corrupt officials, ensures a steady supply of cocaine, marijuana, and other narcotics. Some prisoners turn to drugs as a means of escape, numbing themselves to the harsh realities of prison life. Others are forced into selling drugs by powerful gangs, who use the prison as a hub for their illicit operations. Women who become involved in the drug trade inside the prison often find themselves trapped in a dangerous cycle. Once they start selling, they become indebted to the gang leaders who provide the supply. If they fail to meet their quotas or try to leave the trade, they face severe punishment, including beatings, forced prostitution, or even death. Smuggling extends beyond drugs. Weapons, cell phones, and even luxury items such as perfume and jewelry make their way into the prison, creating a black market controlled by those with power and money. This underground economy fuels violence, as rival gangs fight for control over these lucrative resources. The result is a prison where survival depends not on good behavior, but on connections, money, and a willingness to follow the unspoken laws of the criminal underworld. Extortion and exploitation of vulnerable inmates. One of the most devastating effects of corruption and gang control is the extortion of weaker inmates. Women who lack financial support from outside or who refuse to join a gang are often forced into desperate situations just to survive. Some are coerced into smuggling drugs for the gangs, while others are forced into prostitution within the prison, with corrupt guards acting as intermediaries. Those who have no money or protection are often required to pay for basic necessities that should be provided by the prison. Inmates may have to rent a space to sleep, buy their own food from gang-controlled markets, or pay bribes just to be left alone. Failure to meet these demands can result in violent punishments, including beatings, starvation, or even death. Even family members of inmates are not safe from extortion. Gangs often demand payments from relatives outside the prison, threatening to harm or kill the incarcerated woman if the money is not delivered. These families, already struggling with the financial and emotional burden of having a loved one in prison, are left with impossible choices: either pay the gangs or risk losing their family member to violence. Judicial corruption and the absence of justice. Corruption does not stop at the prison walls. The Brazilian judicial system itself is plagued by bribery and political influence, making it difficult for inmates to receive fair treatment. Wealthy prisoners can often pay for better conditions, shorter sentences, or even early release, while poor inmates are left to suffer under the full weight of the law. Public defenders are often overworked and underfunded, meaning that many women in São Luís do not receive adequate legal representation. Some remain in prison long after their sentences should have ended simply because their cases are forgotten or ignored. Others receive harsh punishments for minor offenses, while those with money and power escape justice. The cycle of corruption ensures that São Luís is not a place of rehabilitation, but rather a breeding ground for further criminality. Women who enter the prison as first-time offenders often leave as hardened criminals, having been forced into a world of gang loyalty, drug trafficking, and violence just to survive. Psychological toll and mental health crisis. The psychological impact of incarceration in São Luís Female Prison is just as devastating as the physical hardships. Living in a brutal environment marked by overcrowding, violence, corruption, and neglect takes an immense toll on the mental health of inmates. Many women enter the prison already suffering from trauma, addiction, or mental illness, and once inside, they receive little to no psychological support. Instead of rehabilitation, they experience extreme stress, isolation, and emotional deterioration. The absence of proper mental health care, combined with the daily struggles of survival, pushes many women into severe depression, anxiety, self-harm, and even suicide. Pre-existing trauma and the impact of incarceration. Most women incarcerated at São Luís come from backgrounds of poverty, abuse, and neglect. Many have experienced sexual violence, domestic abuse, or childhood trauma long before they ever set foot in prison. Some were involved in drug addiction, others in prostitution or petty crime, often as a result of their desperate circumstances. When these women enter São Luís, their psychological wounds remain untreated, and instead of finding support or rehabilitation, they are thrown into an environment that only worsens their suffering. The prison experience itself is profoundly traumatizing. From the moment they arrive, women are stripped of their dignity, forced to endure overcrowded and unsanitary conditions, and exposed to constant threats of violence. They live in a state of perpetual fear, never knowing when they might be attacked by another inmate or abused by a guard. The lack of safety and stability prevents them from ever feeling secure, leading to chronic stress and psychological breakdowns. Isolation and loneliness. One of the most psychologically damaging aspects of São Luís Female Prison is the extreme isolation many inmates experience. For those who do not have strong connections with fellow prisoners or the protection of a gang, loneliness becomes overwhelming. Women are separated from their families, including their children, with little opportunity for visits or communication. The emotional pain of being cut off from loved ones is unbearable for many, especially mothers who are unable to care for or even see their children. Even within the prison, many inmates suffer from social isolation. Those who do not have money or connections are often left to fend for themselves, rejected by the more dominant prisoners, and ignored by the prison staff. This sense of abandonment deepens feelings of worthlessness and despair, making it even harder for women to maintain their mental stability. suicide and self-harm as a cry for help. With no access to proper mental health care and no hope for a better future, many inmates turn to self-harm or suicide as a means of coping with their suffering. The combination of stress, fear, and emotional pain becomes too much to bear, leading some women to engage in acts of self-mutilation or suicide attempts. In many cases, these desperate acts go unnoticed or dismissed by prison staff. Instead of receiving psychological support, women who attempt suicide or engage in self-harm are often punished, placed in solitary confinement, or mocked by guards. There is no system in place to address the root causes of their distress, leaving these women trapped in a downward spiral of suffering. Those who show visible signs of mental illness, such as severe depression, paranoia, or psychosis, are not given proper medical treatment. Instead of receiving therapy or medication, they're often ridiculed, ignored, or placed in isolation, where their conditions worsen. Some are left to wander the prison in a daze, completely detached from reality, while others become targets of abuse from fellow inmates who take advantage of their vulnerability. Drug abuse as an escape from reality. For many inmates, the only way to cope with the psychological torment of prison life is through drugs. Despite strict regulations, narcotics are widely available within São Luís, smuggled in by corrupt guards and controlled by powerful gangs. Women turn to drug use not just as a form of recreation, but as a means of escaping their unbearable reality. Addiction becomes another trap within the prison system. Once hooked on drugs, inmates often find themselves indebted to the gangs that control the supply. They may be forced into prostitution, drug dealing, or violent acts just to maintain their habit. The lack of rehabilitation programs means that even those who wish to break free from addiction have no support system to help them recover. For women who are already addicted before entering prison, the lack of proper withdrawal treatment makes their suffering even worse. Many are left to endure painful withdrawal symptoms in filthy, overcrowded cells with no medical assistance. Instead of receiving help, they are treated as criminals first and human beings second. The breakdown of identity and self-worth. One of the most insidious effects of long-term incarceration is the gradual breakdown of self-identity and self-worth. Women in São Luís are constantly dehumanized, both by the prison system and by the society that has forgotten them. They are treated as mere numbers, locked away and discarded, with little hope of ever being seen as anything more than criminals. This psychological erosion leads many inmates to internalize their suffering, believing that they deserve the conditions they live in. They stop hoping for a better life, stop believing in their own worth, and resign themselves to a future of pain and neglect. Some who are released from prison find it impossible to reintegrate into society, feeling lost and unwanted. Without rehabilitation or psychological support, they often fall back into the same patterns of crime and addiction that led them to prison in the first place. Lack of rehabilitation and the vicious cycle of recidivism. São Luís Female Prison, like many other correctional facilities in Brazil, fails in its fundamental duty to rehabilitate inmates and prepare them for reintegration into society. Instead of offering education, vocational training, or psychological support, the prison system is designed purely for punishment, leaving incarcerated women with little hope for a better future. Without meaningful opportunities for personal growth or skill development, many women leave São Luís more broken and hardened than when they arrived, trapped in a cycle of crime and imprisonment that seems almost impossible to escape. A system designed for punishment, not rehabilitation. The prison system in Brazil, particularly at São Luís, is built on the principle of retribution rather than rehabilitation. In theory, incarceration should serve as an opportunity for offenders to reform, to understand the consequences of their actions, and to acquire skills that will help them lead productive lives after release. However, the reality inside São Luís is the complete opposite. Women are treated as criminals first and human beings second. From the moment they enter the prison, they're stripped of their dignity, their agency, and their hope. There are no structured programs to help them develop job skills, no educational opportunities to increase their knowledge, and no psychological counseling to address the traumas that may have led them to crime in the first place. Instead of being given the tools to change their lives, they're left to survive in a brutal, lawless environment where only the strongest or the most corrupt manage to gain any power. The absence of education and skill development. One of the most critical failures of São Luís Female Prison is the lack of access to education and vocational training. Many of the women incarcerated here come from impoverished backgrounds, where they had little to no access to quality schooling. Some are illiterate or barely educated, making it nearly impossible for them to find legal employment once they are released. In many prison systems worldwide, inmates are given the opportunity to earn degrees, learn trades, or participate in job training programs. However, at São Luís, these opportunities are virtually non-existent. There are no formal classes, no libraries, and no structured learning environments. Any educational activities that do exist are often informal and poorly funded, benefiting only a small fraction of the prison population. Without education or job skills, women leaving São Luís face a harsh reality. Employers are already hesitant to hire former prisoners, and without a basic education or vocational training, their chances of finding stable employment are even lower. This lack of opportunity forces many women back into the same criminal activities that led them to prison in the first place: drug trafficking, theft, or prostitution, because they see no other way to survive. Psychological rehabilitation, a missing component. For many incarcerated women, crime is not just a choice, but a consequence of deep-rooted psychological trauma, addiction, and social neglect. Many have suffered years of abuse, violence, and exploitation before they ever committed a crime. Others have been trapped in cycles of addiction that cloud their judgment and push them toward illegal activities. In an effective prison system, these underlying issues would be addressed through therapy, counseling, and rehabilitation programs. Inmates would be given the chance to understand and process their past traumas, helping them make better choices in the future. However, at São Luís, psychological support is virtually non-existent. There are no trained counselors regularly available to speak with inmates. No mental health professionals work to identify and treat conditions like depression, PTSD, or addiction. Instead, women are left to deal with their suffering alone, with many turning to drugs, violence, or self-harm as a coping mechanism. Those who do show signs of severe mental illness are often ignored, mocked, or punished rather than treated. Without addressing the psychological reasons behind their actions, these women are set up for failure. They leave prison carrying the same emotional scars, the same self-destructive behaviors, and the same lack of self-worth that led them into the system in the first place. With no psychological rehabilitation, their chances of making positive life changes are slim. The vicious cycle of recidivism. Because São Luís fails to provide meaningful rehabilitation, most women who leave the prison find themselves returning within a short period. The lack of education, job opportunities, and psychological healing means that many former inmates have no viable path to a different life. Society often refuses to accept them, employers turn them away, and their own families may reject them due to the stigma of incarceration. With nowhere to turn, many fall back into criminal activities simply to survive. For some women, the prison system itself becomes a strange form of security. Despite its brutality, prison provides a form of structure, however cruel it may be. For those who have no home, no job prospects, and no support system outside, the idea of re-entering society is terrifying. Some even commit crimes intentionally just to return to prison, knowing that at least behind bars, they will have food and shelter, even if it comes at the cost of their dignity. The role of society in breaking the cycle. The failure of São Luís is not just a prison issue, it is a societal issue. The lack of rehabilitation programs inside the prison reflects a larger failure of the justice system and society as a whole. Women who end up in São Luís are often victims of poverty, abuse, and systemic inequality, and yet they are treated as if their criminal behavior exists in isolation from these larger problems. If society truly wants to reduce crime and lower recidivism rates, the approach to incarceration must change. Rather than treating prisoners as lost causes, there must be an investment in rehabilitation, education, and reintegration programs. Former inmates need support, job opportunities, and access to mental health care to successfully rebuild their lives. Without these changes, São Luís Female Prison will remain a revolving door, trapping women in an endless cycle of crime, punishment, and despair. The conditions inside São Luís Female Prison paint a grim picture of a system that punishes but does not rehabilitate. The overcrowding, violence, corruption, and lack of basic human rights create an environment where inmates are not reformed but further broken. Women enter the prison with deep scars, many from a lifetime of abuse, poverty, and systemic neglect, and leave with even more. Without intervention, the cycle of crime and incarceration will continue. The Brazilian prison system, and society as a whole, must recognize that true justice is not just about punishment. It is about rehabilitation, reintegration, and giving people the chance to rebuild their lives. There must be investments in education, vocational training, mental health support, and reintegration programs that give former inmates a real chance at a different future. São Luís Female Prison is a reflection of deeper societal failures that can only be addressed through systemic change. Until these reforms take place, the women inside São Luís will remain trapped in a brutal and unforgiving world, one where survival overshadows any hope for redemption. It is time to break the cycle and recognize that every person, no matter their past, deserves a chance at a better future.